my memory is correct, Dee, you reached out to me for two reasons. One, I think you said you read something in one of my prefaces or introductory things that I wrote saying that
Yeah,
I had
your Buddhist.
mystical experiences. But then I also, did I fill out a survey for you? You did a bunch of surveys?
Yeah. I was doing this course on. I was teaching this course on metaphysics, and there was a unit. I took it over from somebody else, and so there was a unit on free will, and so I was trying to incorporate kind of Asian aspects into the metaphysics course because it was very analytical, as the whole program is here. And so I came across your book, Buddhism and Free Will, and I've also was well into this project of doing Buddhism and the paranormal. And I read your preface where you talk about having paranormal experiences, and I'm just like, oh, we've got to interview this person. And so I contacted you, and I invited you to do the survey because the survey was still live at that point. So you did the survey, as I recall, and then we followed it up with the series of interviews. I think the survey opened in 2019 and it closed in like kind of mid 2021. Yeah.
Sounds about right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it was supposed to just be one interview, but it kept going. It wound up having like four or something like that because there was so
Yeah. I
much
think there was like
coming up.
three
You were like,
major ones.
yeah, you wanted to hear more. There was a lot more than you expected, I think, in terms of my stories. Yeah.
Well, and then I always wanted to keep it open ended. So if the conversation needed to carry on, and definitely I think it was definitely well worth the time that was invested. So as Rick knows, but Robert, you probably don't know, I have a entire chapter is just kind of devoted to Rick and his experiences. So it's a big part of the book. And then also because you're going on record, with your actual name, because I have a number of people are going to be anonymous. I think that's really key too. So yeah, you're going to be it's a major it's kind of like it's like you're sort of the rock star of the book in some ways.
Yeah. I just
He's
thought
known as
that,
the amazing Rick Repetti in our circle of friends.
Oh, the
So I'm not
amazing Rick.
surprised at all. Yeah.
or sometimes the remarkable Rick Repetti, or
Sometimes a remarkable, right?
um,
Yeah.
yeah, which I
It
thought.
sounds like a circus. It sounds like a circus. And now the remarkable
Yeah, the spotlights he'll go on and it dims and a curtain opens
center
and then he shows
ring.
up in a
Yeah,
top hat.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I decided to not be anonymous because it's part of my coming into a kind of intellectual honesty and confidence about myself and my experiences. Having your reaction to them, which was very kind of supportive, and there were elements of you recognizing the validity of things, that you brought out certain details about my own experience, and maybe because you'd seen and studied many others, that just the mirroring back from you made me feel like, okay, there's somebody who gets this, who believes it, who understands it. And most of like, I'm an analytic philosopher, and most of those people think all of this is crazy. They don't believe
Yep.
in these things, most of them. And so I just thought, well, I've always wanted a kind of share. I think that my having had those experiences was really meaningful and important, changed my life. And they're philosophically like transformative, and it's just played an essential role in the whole trajectory of my life. Like, having had those experiences put me on this philosophical path that I'm on. And
Absolutely.
it changed
Absolutely.
my life. It made me who I am. So I have to be honest about that. So I thought
Yeah,
I put my name on that, rather than be anonymous.
absolutely. And I totally get that. With my Altered States book, I have my kind of autobiographical postscript, and I was like, because people that I was talking to experience, personal experience really counts for a lot. And I thought it would be kind of dishonest if I didn't, talk about my own experience because it was so important. And I totally get that. And I think that that's kind of what's needed. And that's kind of what, when I was writing the book on psychedelics, and this was like 2010, and this was before the whole big thing like kind of took
Oh,
off and everything, that, to there's got to be some people at the vanguard that are willing to come out and actually and be honest about this stuff if we're going to move the conversation forward. And yeah, and I think, you know, having and I think being able to create a venue where people are comfortable talking and they don't feel like they're going to be judged, I think counts for a lot. And you're absolutely right, and that's a huge point that I try to make in my book, is that these things, if we can bracket out these kind of arguments that go nowhere of whether this is real or not real, look at people's personal experience, and then see what a huge impact that they've had on their lives, then basically I come to the conclusion they're real enough because they change the whole trajectory of your life. You know, it's like, you know, you're pretty much, you know, one of the leading authorities on Buddhism and free will now, and you wouldn't be if like that stuff like hadn't happened to you. So it's like, you know, why wouldn't you talk about that? You know, and it seems almost disingenuous kind of not to, but because there's such a strong taboo around it, people don't. And I think that's one of the things I'm hoping with the book to do, is just sort of break some of that silence and allow people to start feeling more comfortable talking about it in an open forum. Yeah.
Can
Yeah,
you describe the scope of the book a little bit and the nature of the studies that involved Rick, just to give me especially, but just anyone that might watch
Yeah,
this
sure. It's like
idea?
a bit of a fly on the wall. You got to watch out when Rick and I start talking, because we
No,
can
I
really
love,
go. We can
I can get
really
lost in
go.
Rick conversations for hours
It's
too. Yeah,
like,
he's the
Rick,
best.
forget about leaving in a couple of minutes. So you're gonna have to reschedule your.
Before you answer that question, Dee, though, I wanted to say that one of the contributors to that book on Buddhism and free will, Karen Myers, gave me a hard time about the fact that I was so minimalistic about the fact that I had had those experiences in my
All
preface.
right.
He said, you know, you said that, but the whole book and all of your writings, it's like you're just pushing this kind of naturalistic, it's like you're kowtowing to this reductionist audience. Stop doing that, you know, in a way.
Right.
And I was like, you know, you're right. So that was also right around the time that you were interviewing me, that she was giving me that feedback after the book, because we got involved in a couple of other projects together.
Yeah, and I think you got to you have to take baby steps, right? You got to crawl before you can walk or run. And so just the fact that you even put it in the preface, I think it was
Right.
like there was a part of
I
you
was
was like,
testing the waters. Yeah.
yeah,
Like
you're just
I
like,
had
I'm just
some
gonna throw this out
experiences.
there. People will ignore it if they, but the book will stand as a work of analytical philosophy
Right.
regardless. And so you're it was just a bit testing the waters kind of thing. But
Yeah.
it just shows that, karma works, how karma works, right? You planted those seeds, and then look, the fruit that comes out of it.
Yeah. So
Okay,
Robert's
Robert.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Robert's question about the overall project, and then like kind of where kind of Rick kind of fits into it. Okay, well, um, where best to start? I guess a real kind of turning point that made me decide to write this book was that I read a book called Mind Beyond Brain, and it's called Buddhism, Science, and the Paranormal. It looks like you're nodding your head, Robert. So I'm assuming
I've got
you've
it up
heard
on
of
my
it.
other screen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
there's
got it
a
up
great
yourself,
quote by
right?
Thomas Nagel in the beginning, and it looks really good. Yeah.
Yeah, have you read? I don't know if you've read it yet, but
No, I've seen through it. I had heard about it before, and then as I was
yeah,
reading your CV, I was like, "Oh, great! This is kind of recent and sounds adjacent to what maybe you and Rick were discussing."
yeah. And what happened was I read the book, and it's really like there's this. It's foregrounding. There's a kind of think tank at the University of Virginia called the Division of Perceptual Studies that was really started by Ian Stevenson in 1967, which studies the paranormal. And Ian Stevenson was famous for his work on studies in
Reincarnate.
reincarnation. But the think tank does all kinds of different types of psi phenomena, apparitional phenomena, things like that. And so it's really great at sort of and it's different chapters written by mostly scientists in the research that they've done. But the Buddhism part was really light, and basically the Buddhism kind of sets the context, but it was really like there's a Bond master Tibetan Bon master who kind of held a little like 1 day symposium thing, and that's kind of what inspired the scientists to write this book. And so the Buddhism is very light, and it doesn't really go into two things. I mean, because I wrote a review of the book, so as a Buddhist studies person, two things I was disappointed in was there's a sort of a minimal engagement with Buddhism, like Buddhist thought, Buddhist philosophy, and then also there wasn't really an engagement with sort of Buddhism like on the ground, like contemporary Buddhism as it's being practiced and lived now. And so I thought, okay, it was a bit of maybe false advertising to really foreground the Buddhism in the book, but it was still a very interesting book. But there's a gap there, and I wanted to fill that gap from a more Buddhist studies perspective. And I think part of that was also informed by the last two books that I've written. So 2 books ago, I wrote my Altered States book, which was on Buddhism and psychedelics. And it was basically Buddhism and psychedelic spirituality in America. And so what I did for that book is, again, I did an online survey. I followed it up with interviews. And then, pre-COVID days when you could actually go around and travel, I actually went to the States and traveled around. And it was a bit of a, it was kind of a road trip with a pun on on trip, where I went to, Southwest and San Francisco and
I'm just
East
studying
Coast.
Altered States.
I was studying, yeah, I was actually studying this stuff.
But participant research.
Yeah, just trying to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was as an anthropologist, I have to go into the field, right? I was a participant observer of this kind of
Carlos
stuff.
Castaneda.
And I did, as if you've looked at the book, I did go to the Peyote Way Church of God in Arizona, and I did peyote out in the desert and stuff like that. But one of the things that really struck me, though, is that I met a number of people that had very profound paranormal experiences that were not directly connected to psychedelics. And sometimes people would, I'd present at a conference, and sometimes people would come up to me afterwards and say, okay, such and such happened to me once, just kind of like off the record. And I mentioned a few of these in my new book on the paranormal, but one of them really struck me. It was a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism who, as a post-grad, was like in Nepal and doing, it was also a practitioner and doing the sadhana to the goddess Tara. And then Tara just appears, right? Just appears like full-blown visual, auditory, and starts telling him all these things that are going to happen to him in his life, who he's going to marry, the children he's going to have, the names of those children. And then he said, and all of those things came true. And this is someone, he's not on the record about this at all. He's quite high up in the field, a well-established academic. And he was not the only person like this. And so I was kind of like, all right. So this is actually, because there's this kind of narrative, there's this kind of modernist narrative that, when you read about, great Buddhist scholars, say like Tsongkhapa in the Tibetan tradition, who was being, in constant contact with Manjushri and receiving teachings from the Bodhisattva of wisdom and stuff like that. You're like, oh, okay, this is kind of pious, hagiography, right? But we all know, because we're so much smarter as modern people.
Like, we can't touch it.
Yeah, we don't believe that kind of stuff, and we just bracket that out. Say, okay, that's just fiction. And I was like, maybe it's not so fictional. And so what I decided to do was to interlude is in between that Altered States book, I wrote another book on non-dual Shaivism, which is a medieval Hindu philosophy that almost became extinct. It was just there was just a small community of Brahmins in Kashmir that still practiced it. But then beginning in like the 70s, there was this kind of revival, and it's been sort of grafted onto the New Age, and as a kind of yogic kind of / neo-tantric, philosophy. But again, I use the same approach of like, I went to India and I met some people, and I did some high-end yoga studio stuff and some online things and some interviews. And so I basically, traditionally, I started out as a kind of Buddhist philologist. So my first book was on ancient um, Indian Buddhism, and particularly kind of textual studies. But my last two books, I've kind of transitioned into kind of more contemporary stuff, and I'm particularly interested in how contemporary practitioners, in a very different kind of context, incorporate and draw from traditional sources, but in a kind of modern way. And so with this, so I've sort of developed this sort of methodology. And so with this book, what I thought I would do is say, okay, I'm going to look at the paranormal in Buddhism, but as told by contemporary Buddhist practitioners. But I'm going to contextualize that in two ways. First, because I was trained as a philologist in Indian Buddhism. Chapter one is going to be the paranormal in Indian Buddhism, looking at it from the Indian context, from early Buddhism all the way up to through Mahayana Tantric Buddhism. And then the next chapter, what I do is I look at the kind of modern Western study of the paranormal. So starting from the 1800s, looking at the Society for Psychical Research, going up through people like Charles Fort, J.B. Rhine, Charles Tart, Dean Radin, U.S. government studies of remote viewing, UFOs and the paranormal, like Jacques Vallée and things like that. And so I try to look at what has this kind of fringe, what we can call like fringe science, been saying about the paranormal and research that's been coming out of the paranormal. So I have these two discourses. I have this kind of traditional, canonical accounts, and then I have this kind of modern, kind of scientific accounts. And then I transitioned from that into my own research, which was based on I put together an online survey through the SurveyMonkey website, and there was about 115 respondents to that. And then kind of at the end of that survey, I said, well, if you'd be interested in following that up with a 60-minute, interview that might be recorded, please leave your email. And so I was able to, about 10 of the 115, follow up with them to do interviews. And then some of them are actually, it was really Rick and one other person that kind of grew from the 60 minutes into several sessions. And so then what I decided to do for the rest of the book is I have the next two chapters. I look at contemporary Buddhist stories of psi phenomena, so things like clairvoyance, telepathy, precognition. And then the next chapter, I look specifically at out of body experiences, near death experiences, and that's then what I call like close encounters. So it'll be like encounters with non-human intelligences, and I introduce these by looking at the kind of some basically light statistical data based on the survey, and then survey responses, which some of them were very brief, like I had a dream once and it came true. Okay. And then some of the survey responses were a bit more detailed. And then after doing the survey stuff, then I would go into the interviews. So, and the interviews would go into a lot more depth about kind of individual experiences. And then, but what I decided to do is, because I had my interview with Rick, and then my interviews with Rick, and then I had another participant who we'll just call Kat because she's using a pseudonym, who I would call like exceptional subjects or sensitives, because they've just had lifelong kind of experiences, and I wanted to look at a kind of more like a life narrative. So seeing how the paranormal works in the story of their whole life, rather than picking out kind of, okay, these are weird kind of anecdotes, but seeing how the whole thing kind of fits together in someone's life story. So like Rick is chapter 5, Kat's chapter 6, chapter 7 is my conclusions. And the kind of basically I make an argument for we need to, phenomenology might be an excellent way to approach the paranormal. And I draw on ideas from Merleau-Ponty, and then I also kind of make an argument that there's really strong kind of phenomenological elements in Buddhism right from the beginning. So it's a kind of, my approach is kind of loosely a kind of Buddhist phenomenological approach. And then I do my thing that I do in the altered states, which I have is my autobiographical postscript. So I talk about some of my own experiences. And then, yeah, that's it. So that's the project. So Rick's bit is a kind of crucial pivot because it's really, I think I've also over the years come to the conclusion that, really narratives are foundational to how we understand ourselves and our world. And so so what I try to do is I start out with these very kind of formalized discourses, your canonical accounts, and then your kind of scientific accounts. And then I transition to this kind of more narrativity and the role of narrativity. So in a way, Rick's chapter is a kind of pivotal movement of like kind of locating the kind of narrativity. And I look at this like the contemporary stories as a kind of, it's almost a kind of fits into kind of folklore studies, or because it's really looking, folklore literally means like the knowledge of the folk, right? Knowledge of the people. And what I found and what kind of surveys have backed up is that, quite a large chunk of, not just kind of Western population, but in almost any population that's been surveyed, the people believe in some form of paranormal. And so there's this huge disjunct between this kind of very widespread popular belief and then this kind of academic kind of eschewing of, poo-pooing as like, this is all just woo-woo and not worthy of our attention. And so I'm trying to recover these voices of people that have had experiences and, do believe in this and why they do, and trying to make an argument that the academy has to get over these kind of dogmatic presuppositions, this kind of scientific thinking, and return to a more kind of radically empirical approach, and also realizing that data and facts are not like free floating things that we can objectively discern. And I think that's where the phenomenology comes in, because I make an argument that there is always that subjective element to any kind of knowledge, and so we can't sort of tease out meaning and fact and interpretation from like what's really happening. They've always been right from the beginning, kind of meshed together. And I think the work that Jeffrey Kripal has done in the paranormal has really informed a lot of that. How he talks about that that distinction between, for instance, in the UFO phenomena, between nuts and bolts and then kind of paranormal things that are happening. They're inextricably kind of woven together. And so I make an argument basically for that. So I hope that answered the question. That's kind of like the whole project kind of. If there are any specific questions on it, I'm happy to answer. So
that was really very, very well described. I have an even better understanding of the book now myself. Do you have a title yet? I don't remember.
Yeah, they keep playing around with the title. I mean, I originally wanted to call it Contemporary Buddhist Tales of the Paranormal. But then they were like, some of the other titles they proposed are something like Extraordinary States, Contemporary Converts, Experiences of the Paranormal. There's some talk of, in the editorial board about how, and this is something we're still hashing out, but of the people who identify as Buddhist in my survey, about 89% are like converts to Buddhism. So I thought just by saying contemporary Buddhist, that somehow I was, kind of ignoring or overlooking that Buddhism is like an Asian phenomenon, and that I'm kind of privileging this kind of, this white kind of upper middle class voice, which I make very clear that, this is, part of the way that the study was put together, because it is in English, and you need a certain competency in the English language, and also internet connection and things like that. There's like obvious biases that are sort of built into the demographic, but contemporary convert Buddhists are still Buddhists. So yeah, so there's some haggling about whether convert's going to go in the title, and so yeah, so we don't know yet. But I wanted to have the tales part in there because I wanted to foreground the narrative aspect of it, and then obviously the contemporary component, and there needs to be something in the paranormal. But as you know what it's like as an author, though, it's like you're allowed some input into the title, but it's really the people that are doing the marketing that will just will decide at the end of the day.
The book cover as well. Just so you
Yeah.
know, Metzinger's book, by the way, the subtitle has something in there like 500 plus cases of something or other. I forget.
Okay, yeah.
But he's got that in there because he wanted to highlight that. He's highlighting the phenomenology of those people's experiences also.
Yep. Yep.
Because he does the
and I think that's
stuff,
fantastic.
like you said, the traditional canonical accounts, then the contemporary scientific accounts, and then the emphasis on the actual cases, the narratives, what people say, and then his reasoning about it all. Yeah, your project and his are very related. The difference is the target. He's targeting the pure consciousness or non-dual experience, and you're targeting the paranormal aspect. They're very, very closely related.
Absolutely, and that's why I was really excited when you were telling me about that book, because I think that's so important to look at those kind of three in conjunction, because what you've had traditionally is, you get your people that are, philologists that do canonical sources in the original languages, and then you get your contemporary kind of people that are doing that kind of edge sciencey kind of stuff. And then you have actually people that are having the experiences, and a lot of times there's no dialogue that kind of sees the threads. And I think that's how phenomenology can connect the threads, because the science is always happening within a cultural and historical context, and then so it can contextualize the science, but it also puts the first person accounts on a more equal footing, rather than having it be, okay, that's anecdotal, so we're not going to pay attention to it. It's like, but like and this is Jeffrey, Kripal says this too. It's like, we're anecdotal, it's like anecdotal is like a bad word that you refer to stuff because it doesn't fit your data or something. Yeah.
Another friend of Robert's and John Vervaeke's and mine is a fellow named Greg Enriquez, who's a brilliant psychologist and a kind of autodidact philosopher too, as far as I'm concerned. He's one of these big theorist kind of guys who's come up with a unified theory of knowledge. And at the core of it, he gives this whole model, which is really comprehensive, but he says, what's missing in the it's like an enlightenment gap between the objective and the subjective, is we are not anecdotes. We're right in the center of it. Every one of us and our experience is valid in terms of the study of reality and knowledge. How could we ignore that? So yeah.
Yeah, and I think, basically what my conclusion for the book is, basically I call it a prolegomenon to the kind of phenomenology in the study of the paranormal. But I finished by making the claim that this kind of hierarchical stratification we have in the academy, where somehow like the hard sciences are more real and therefore worthy of more funding than like the social sciences and the humanities, that we have to just get rid of that. We have to, because it's very fracturing. We need to look at the whole picture, and then just exactly what you said. We can't erase our subjectivity from that, and that's and I get that really from Indian philosophy, because right back from the earliest days, subjectivity was always front and center, and it was always based on, what is the world like as experienced from this point of subjectivity. And then that's where they got all the, that's how they get insights into things like the nature of consciousness, because they've, it's a tradition that's invested centuries in that kind of phenomenological exploration of consciousness and altered states of consciousness. And it's just to just try to ignore that or pretend that it doesn't count. And I think it's happening in a lot of, this whole area of contemplative studies and things like that, and the stuff that you're doing. It's like meditation, philosophy of meditation. Like 30 years ago, they'd be like, "What?" It's not. It's like you just, yeah. But I think there was things that happened, all the way, the baby boomers and that whole cultural revolution that seemed to have stalled and failed. I think in some ways there were some ideas that were planted there that are finally coming, in some ways coming to germination now, because we sort of gotten enough distance from it that we can be like, hey, okay.
And enough of us who were kids experiencing those shifts in consciousness are now scholars writing about it. We've got credentials. We feel confident to say that.
You've got the tenure, and so you can actually, you can actually come out and say, okay, this is what really happened. I think that was the great thing about my Altered States book too, is like I got some really good, baby boomer stuff like on record, because it's like they were far enough away from it that they felt they could talk about it, but still young enough that they could remember enough of the details of like what happened. So it was like
paradoxical, because the saying, if you remember it,
right. If you weren't,
but
if you remember the 60s, you weren't there, right?
But this is the thing about episodic memory. Like if you've got a phenomenal episodic experience, fragments of it, you'll never forget them. So, you might forget a lot. Like I forgot, I told you this when you were interviewing me. I had so many of these paranormal experiences. I forgot like 90% of them, but the ones that I remember, they stood out because they were kind of like uniquely salient or something. But meanwhile,
I think, yep.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say too that it also in some ways reinforces a point that I'm trying to make, is that because, I remember reading something that about memory where, when we remember something, we're not actually, every time we remember it, we're not actually remembering the original event. We're just remembering the last time we remembered it.
Right.
And so what happens is it's just like, but the reason why certain things stick out is because they were significant, and they keep their significance, which means that they stay within the kind of, they stay within your consciousness as part of your overall kind of frame stories. So it just shows how, right from the beginning, interpretation is important, but it stays important because if they weren't salient, then you would just forget them. It's like, I had a lucid dream, like when I was, I don't remember, might have been like 8 or 9 years old, where it kind of informed, like I still remember it like it was yesterday, because it had such a huge impact on like the entire rest of my life. So, and how many dreams do we remember? But certain dreams, they're dreams, and then they're dreams, and then they're dreams, right? So some dreams are like, whoa, that was some message came through. Yeah.
Well, look, I feel bad, but I have to run. But I know that you and I did a lot of talking, so this will now give Robert a chance to do a little more talking in my absence. Because you and I, Dee, I think we could go on and on forever.
Yeah, and
really
I think
great
it
to
was
see
part
you.
of that rapport that actually made this kind of happen. Because if it wasn't there, I don't think it would have.
That's right. Yeah, we did connect the very first time we spoke. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, great to see you, and Robert.
Good to see you too, Rick.
And the two of you, I'm looking forward to seeing this recording when it's over. So,
good. Yeah.
I'm going to head out.
All right. Take care, Rick.
Bye, Rick.
Ciao.
So let me process a little bit of what you said for a second. And
yeah, sure.
So
There's
how
a lot
do
of
you
it. Yeah.
define paranormal, just so that we're both on the same page? And even before you do that, so I've studied about 10 years of cognitive science and applied psychology.
Yeah.
So I have a pretty healthy cognitive background, and I know of like parapsychology, which you would be insane to try and get a job in, because there's like, I don't even know if there's like one real parapsychologist in the US right now. that's
Yeah,
publishing.
right.
And like I know Rick, and I just find it fascinating that either there's like levels deep in our unconsciousness that can emerge, or
Yep.
there's something that like we can't perceive that can emanate into our consciousness at times. And then what is that? And if you take a purely like mechanistic um, view of the world, then that gets all kind of pushed away. But if you take maybe a more, I don't know if you're familiar with Henry Corbin, one of like the Jungians and Carl Jung's circle, but
Yep.
the idea of like we're trying to individuate, and these experiences might be helping us grow or transcend some old views or some old self or something like that. So I find it really interesting to hear someone like Rick say, these experiences made me become a philosophy professor, which he's very, very successful at and does great work in. So it's really cool that it's not just some weird encounter with something that is trivial and unimportant, but it could actually be this like life-shaping forces. So yeah, so what is paranormal, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I just use the OED definition. So if you look up the Oxford English Dictionary definition, I can get it for you, but it basically, what is it? What does it say here? Well, let's just, I'll pull it up just because it's right in my introduction.
Cool.
Um, because I talk about that. I say, what? Okay, here we go. OED, designating supposed psychical events and phenomena such as clairvoyance or telekinesis, whose operation is outside the scope of the known laws of nature or of normal scientific understanding or of relating to such phenomena. Yeah. So basically, what I do is I take that as a kind of working definition and I divide it into, as I mentioned earlier, into basically two categories. There's psi phenomena, so psychic phenomena like telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, um, and then the as another kind of loose category, just out of body experiences, near death experiences, and then what I call encounters. So the encounters one they're like relational experiences, so it's you're either encountering like a spirit or of a deceased person or some other type of spirit or a god or a demon or whatever, but it has a kind of relation, there's a kind of relational component to it. And then obviously like when I go into the Buddhist stuff and the Indian stuff, there's different, they have their own kind of vocabulary, so there's terms like siddhis, or in Buddhism they're called riddhis. They're like kind of yogic powers that you can attain through meditation. But at the same time, the Indian tradition had ideas about magic, too, that where there's certain efficacy in casting spells, incantations, the use of different substance and drugs, for example. Um, and then I also point out how, in a lot of traditional cultures, part of their worldview are their whole hosts of like non-human entities that people are interacting with all the time. So in a sense, for these cultures, that's normal rather than paranormal. But the reason why I call it paranormal is because I'm using this kind of Western scientific slash kind of materialistic worldview as a kind of foil. But I point out that words have genealogies and they're not value neutral. But I'm going to use paranormal as this kind of provisional placeholder for these kind of anomalous or unusual phenomena, as a way of looking at them. And when I need to go into more nuanced kind of terminology, and if I have the skill to, say like in the Indian context, for example, then I do. And sometimes my informants will actually use that vocabulary specifically. Yeah, so I highlight that. So that's kind of what I'm using as a. I'm saying that it's not unproblematic, but I'm gonna use it as a kind of provisional term. Um, so yeah, and then as far as the other stuff is like, you know, Jungian or whatever. It's like I really kind of I, I say right from the beginning that I kind of bracket metaphysics, that I don't have a kind of, and I think it's important because, and this is why I use a phenomenology in a specific way to say, okay, and and not getting deeply into like Husserl and Heidegger and stuff like that, because it's just like I think it gets too technical and stuff, but basically drawing on primarily Merleau-Ponty's ideas of this idea of the life world, that the life world is this world where that subjectivity and objectivity are things that we abstract, but our more immediate experience is this kind of entangled. Our subjectivities are entangled in the world, and with other subjectivities, and that they have histories, and that this is a continual kind of like unfolding. Right. And so I think the danger of metaphysics is they kind of foreclose things, right? So if you say, if you're a metaphysical materialist, you say everything has to be reduced to the functions of matter, and so none of this isn't true because it can't be true, and that's just bad. I mean, that's just faulty reasoning, right? So if you have this kind of a priori presupposition that this can't be true, therefore it's not true, and then you can dismiss it, I'm saying we got to do away with that, right? So we're just going to look at the phenomena, and I think that cuts both ways. So if you're like a metaphysical idealist and saying everything is just pure consciousness, right, then again at a certain point there's going to be an attempted reduction, right, of that there really isn't a material world. I'm not really concrete, like I can throw this rock and it, if I close my eyes, it's not going to hurt me because I can't see it, right? It avoids all of that too. Like I don't have a metaphysical axe to grind.
Yeah.
I'm basically saying that I think that metaphysics is somehow it's kind of a philosophical overreach, and I draw on very specific kind of Mahayana, early Buddhist philosophy, I think, was very phenomenological, which is an argument I make. But then also with the later Mahayana whole idea about emptiness and that all phenomena lack kind of inherent existence or substantiality, a kind of Madhyamaka kind of critique of metaphysics is kind of built in, and saying that basically truth has more kind of, can have pragmatic value and has kind of therapeutic value, and is kind of intimately connected with our own subjectivities and the stories that we tell about the world, and say, okay, well, I want to look at the stories. And sometimes for a lot of the survey data that I got, a lot of this stuff was just, oh yeah, I had a dream once and it came true, or I thought of a friend and then they called, and things like that. So they're kind of like weird, but they're almost kind of like, they're almost like brain farts or something like that.
The brain is generating bad partial possibilities, and once in a while when you think of your best friend, they do call, but the other 75 times that didn't call, you don't really think of it as
exactly. So a lot of these things could have entirely mundane kind of explanations, and sometimes they might not too. I mean, I personally think that we're connected to the world in ways that we don't really fully understand, and that like the idea that like my consciousness is just bounded by my physical body and is separate from everything else, I think that's false. So I think that there is enough evidence in my mind that consciousness has a kind of non-local aspects to it, without then going on and saying that, okay, that consciousness is the kind of metaphysical thing that can exist, without bodies and things like that. I don't think you have to go that far, but you can say that, just from stuff we know about remote viewing and stuff we know about, telepathic experiences and precognitive experiences, that somehow our awareness can exceed the kind of ordinary bounds of this kind of linear space and time. And how is that possible, and what is the mechanism? I don't know, right? But until we can start admitting that these things happen and they have some validity to them, we'll never know, right? Because what we do is it's this kind of cognitive bias where we don't even want to acknowledge that's real. And so Yeah, so I think that's kind of where I'm coming from that. So it's using paranormal in a very sort of provisional, an open-ended way.
Well, like you said, I love Merleau-Ponty, and so do some of my close friends. And taking a phenomenologist first kind of existential stance to being, I think is very smart. And I'm kind of a Neoplatonist, and they frame things as you're in participation with being, and you're not making it, nor are you made by it, but it's a participation. It's like a dialectic, um, pluripotent, but not abstract, like in participation, like a flux that's moving through time space continually with no end or something like that. And so, like Nagarjuna's proposition and negation and assertion of both and negation of both, and some of those kind of more Eastern logics, I think were at least Middle Eastern or Western before the kind of Catholic Reformation and Eastern Orthodox split in Europe. And you find this in kind of that part of the canon or the tradition. And so the idea of having uh, a theosophanic vision that becomes like a philosophy for a person in a world without books, without, concrete information, where there's dangerous animals and there's beneficial normative agents in your environment, and having no guide for that normative ambiguity. I could see, a good philosopher wanting to understand more about, like, Rick's story, where he, a year or so before having an accident with a brother, like foresaw it and saw the truck. And I've had friends that have had similar experiences. I know there's a little bit of literature on deja vu, that if a brain gets tired enough, it'll start like labeling things deja vu. But still, I don't think something as nuanced as what like Rick experienced can be like written off as deja vu. And so I find, again, like a love of wisdom or a love of truth, to really love that scientists like you are trying to explore these, as well as the pure consciousness guys and the free will analytic guys, and like, let's all figure it out. So I think, yeah, I think it's awesome what you're interested in. And what's your like spiritual practice life like, or how does yeah, practices inform your thoughts and things like that?
Oh yeah. Before I get into that, I just
Oh,
want to say
please.
that I discovered Plotinus a few years ago, and I was
Oh,
like,
great. Yeah.
holy crap, man, this has all been here right from the beginning.
Right.
I spent my whole life studying like Asian philosophy, and it's like, and here it is right here, and that thread that goes from Plotinus, Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, alchemical tradition. It's always been there. John Dee, and it's like all the way up to chaos magic, Aleister Crowley. It's just kind of continued. And then
Uh-huh.
I kind of start my second chapter with this quote. There's a book that I don't know, you may have heard of it, called uh, the Myth of Disenchantment. I don't know if you've heard of that book. As
No.
his name is, I just want to get his name right. I'll pull him up here. So let
Jason
me.
Josephson Storm.
Yeah, Joseph Storm. So you have? Did you just
No, I
look it
just
up?
Googled it, but
Oh,
that's awesome.
oh wow, that's a fast. You got some fast googling skills. Yeah, I quote him because he basically talks about that the disenchantment itself is a myth that was
Right.
put forward by some people, and some of the people that all the way from 17th, 18th, into 19th and 20th century, some of the really important people involved in science were also very seriously interested and involved in the paranormal, mediumship, and psychic stuff at the same time. And so there's this kind of it's weird how this discourse on this kind of scientific worldview kind of became a kind of prestige thing, and it worked really hard to in certain sectors to ignore this whole Western history that's been happening like all along, and it's never gone away. And even that whole view of, in the study of religion, they had this idea that, oh, okay, there was this kind of secularization that was happening in society, that religion would kind of fizzle out. And it's like, that hasn't happened either. I mean, what happens is you get whole new age, things springing up everywhere. And so maybe old traditional religious institutions might be dying out, but I deeply feel that, spirituality is a kind of crucial part of who we are as human beings. And so just in the same way that we have, the psychological aspects and physical aspects to us, there's also this kind of a spiritual component to us too. And so we can't, it doesn't matter how hard we try to suppress that or ignore that, in some ways, again, using this kind of psychoanalytic frame, that is actually, the more we try to suppress that, in some ways, the more it will kind of erupt into our awareness, because it's sort of being ignored.
Yeah.
But then, to return to your question, I mean, I started practice, like I learned transcendental meditation when I was like 17.
Oh, wow.
And so I started meditating when I was a teenager, and I did that kind of religiously for a couple years. And then I kind of got disillusioned a bit with their kind of, this view of like, a few years you'll attain cosmic consciousness. And so I got more interested in Buddhism. And so I started studying Buddhism in high school, and also practicing, at first it was Zazen, and then Vipassana. I dabbled a little bit in some, Tibetan techniques, but, for the last, I guess, almost 20 years, I've really been I focus on, my practice is basically mindfulness of breathing. And I'm also a mindfulness instructor, so I've been doing that. Sometimes I'll, go in and do workshops for corporations and things like that, or the military. But these days because I live rurally in New Zealand, I'm in the North Island, and so I'm about 5 minutes outside of just like a little village, and there's an old schoolhouse there, and I do like a free Thursday night mindfulness class as a kind of community service thing. And there's just like a small group of us that sit together. So that's kind of my main sort of meditative practice. But then, studying non-dual Shaivism, so it's kind of intensively for years, and the last, say, decade or so, I think that really does kind of inform my perspective in a lot of ways too. I mean, I really think that, I mean, I'm a non-dualist, so I think you can draw on, there's aspects of Shaivism, Buddhism, Taoism, and, to not to be too trite about it, but, those different paths up the same mountain kind of thing. I think at a certain level, we all have different frames of reference to try to understand things, but I think I believe that there is a, outside of our kind of cognitive frames, that we can directly, intuitively experience the kind of suchness of reality in a kind of non-linguistic, non-conceptual sort of way. But and the nuts and bolts of it, and this is what I tell people too, because I have this whole history of psychedelic use, and psychedelics really aren't a part of my life now, and that's not because I think that they're wrong or anything like that, or have changed my perspective. It's just, being a parent, it's really like parenting is like my main practice, is just like, and as a day to day, like, let's get through today and make sure that everybody is safe and cared for, and fed and clothed, and so sort of the analogy that I like to use is, being a parent is a bit like, you're being a bus driver, but it's 24/7, because at any moment, one of them might fall out of a tree and break their arm, or they might wake up in the middle of the night vomiting with a tummy bug or whatever. So it's like you're always on call. And so I'm very much interested in being grounded in this kind of your ordinary waking consciousness, which is geared towards problem solving. And so I think my mindfulness and my parenting, things like that, are kind of like my main kind of frames. I mean, I've had I've had my fair share of kind of like mystical experiences and things that would, I think would fit into the category of paranormal. And some of them were, again, and this is what I found from people that I've talked to too, is that there seems, there's that whole range of things that are like, okay, that's kind of weird,
Yeah.
but it might have a mundane explanation. And like, okay, that was really weird and much less likely to have a mundane explanation. And I think having that kind of open-ended, like just like I don't know kind of thing, is really important. And I found that with the people, my participants in my study, and Rick as an example, and then Kat, and then some other people in my study, have that very like a real high level of modesty, and which makes, I think, their stories a lot more believable, because they're not trying to sell you something.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? They're not trying to say like, I had this, so I'm special, or I had this, so I know Jesus Christ is like my
Right.
personal savior, or that Buddha is, or whatever. It's
Inflation is
yeah. Go ahead.
rampant in mystical experience, right? The idea that I'm God, or I know something other people don't know, or I didn't have to work for this knowledge. It's easy money or something like that. So I think, yeah, inflation is probably part of growth, I would say. Like, you can't have a child that doesn't inflate their ego from time to time in a way that they need
Yeah,
to
sure,
grow.
sure.
But if you then don't grow emotionally and in a virtuous way, and we just don't have a lot of those containers in society to have real wild, kind of mystical growth or something like that. So then it becomes, you used the word new age earlier, and I think that's one of the most dangerous kind of threats to like real science of alchemy, or science of the paranormal, or things like that, when you start to um, stop asking critical questions, and it's like a different kind of closed-mindedness almost. So
Yeah, and I think that there's this kind of there's a it's like epistemological modesty in a way too, that realizing that we're kind of limited, we're limited kind of finite beings, and we're frail, and we have egos. And so and I think that's kind of where I think that it's important kind of sub story, subtext in my book, is that people that have had some of these experiences, who they were important in their life, but because of their Buddhist training, their Buddhist background, their Buddhist frame, they're kind of like, they don't get too attached to them, or they don't get too attached to what their interpretation of them might be. And I found that, like when we look at Rick's story, he went through this period of really intense kind of paranormal activity in his early adulthood. And then he intentionally wanted to distance himself from that. So he practiced what he called this reverse sadhana, where he gave up his vegetarianism and he started drinking and doing drugs again and things like that, to really just kind of dampen down his like psychic sensitivity. And then that worked to a certain degree, but then he kind of went to the other extreme in that direction, and then switched from sort of that approach to like a much more analytical approach, and saying like, I want to try to intellectually try to get my head around this problem, say the problem of free will. And so reached a certain point where or again, it kind of hits, there's this kind of built-in kind of self-limiting aspect to that approach, but still is able to acknowledge the kind of validity. He likes, like Rick, he talks about, he likes to consider himself a Gnostic agnostic.
yeah.
Which I just love that, because it's like he's had these experiences of gnosis, but at the same time he's an agnostic, so he holds, like, epistemologically, he doesn't make any leaps to being dogmatically attached to any kind of metaphysical thing. He's still like open-ended, curious about what's happened. So there's kind of this razor's edge between those two those two aspects, and I find that level, that level of modesty and kind of integrity. um it's almost like I haven't really, I'm still struggling with this idea, but I have a feeling that, like, some people, especially people who are more empathic, they can kind of sense the truth when they're talking to other people. And there's studies you can do, like psychological, you can read micro expressions and things like that. But I think there's some people that are just naturals, and so when someone's speaking truth, they hear it, and they're almost like a, I'm a big fan of Dune. I don't know if you read science
Yeah,
fiction and stuff,
I
but
love
the
science.
Bene Gesserit, they have these soothsayers that they can discern. And I think that these, when I listen to these certain people, it really rings true. Like, I don't think they're not making it up. First of all, because they're not going to gain any, they're not going to gain, Rick's not going to gain any, like, fame or fortune from telling these stories. Just the opposite. He might be, his colleagues might stigmatize him or whatever. So there's nothing to gain from that. He's not trying to sell anything. But then also there's this kind of sense of uh they're mentally sound, right? They've got their feet on the ground. They're not suffering from schizophrenia or
Right.
something like that. They might be mistaken about what's happened to them, but they seem to be very mentally grounded and telling the truth as best that they recollect it. And I think that kind of evidence, along with, okay, this is what we get out of the lab, this is what we get out of, critical thinking and all these things, that has to play into it, that has to play an important role as like real evidence. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think um again, I think the unconscious is amazing and complex. And you were talking about memory, just the fact that somewhere in our brain there's like the memory of our wedding or our children's birth or a favorite holiday or the first breakup, and that stuff is like hyper salient somewhere in our unconscious, just waiting to pop back up and remind us of a lesson or something. And you look at like Jungian therapists, and Jung would like write letters to Mircea Eliade, and he'd say like, I went to America and I talked to these Native Americans or whatever like language he used, and they had the same dreams as the Africans and as the whites and it's like, how can this kind of other level of memory be in places that were not culturally connected for hundreds or thousands of years? And so I just think that it's either coming from below again, or maybe it's emanating from some higher realm, because that doesn't quite explain premonitions of a holy war or of a brother dying or those kind of things. So I think there's still more to kind of figure out. But um, yeah, I
Yeah,
think
and
that
I
it's
think,
full of symbols, and so
well, and I mean, we were talking about, right, the collective unconscious and what is
right,
the collective unconscious, and there's a whole range, because there's a lot of ambiguity in what actually Jung meant, and then how Jungians have interpreted it. And some people interpret the collective unconscious as just, it's kind of part of our hard wiring, kind of like within our brains, because we're Homo sapiens, and so there's kind of deep structural features that we all share because of that kind of hard wiring. And then there's the kind of what some people might think is the kind of more woo woo version of it, that there's this kind of, it's like the Buddhist storehouse consciousness or something, that there's this kind of metaphysical dark realm, or like deep waters, where these kind of currents move around in. But for me, I mean, because I don't think that our conscious are I don't think we exist as monads of separate
right,
consciousness. I
right.
think that we are entangled with each other. And so I think I'm very happy to accept the collective unconscious as a kind of working hypothesis, that
Yeah.
they're deep archetypes, like, like the wise old man or the witch or the seductress or whatever. These are deep archetypes, and you see them in our stories, right? Joseph Campbell, the whole Jungian thing, the Jedi and the samurai and the
Yeah.
young hero on the quest, and the stuff that I do. I did, for pretty much my entire adult life, I've studied this Buddhist scripture, which is about this young man's journey in ancient India, where he visits 53 different spiritual guides, and some are kings and some are queens and some are goddesses, and there's a prostitute, and there's ascetics, and so it's the whole hero's journey, right? But like from almost 2,000 years ago. And so I think, but I don't necessarily think there's a dichotomy from like coming from above or coming from below. Right. I think it's just coming from outside of what our normal linear our linear experience of space and time is. And I think that our knowledge of our daily kind of what we can call like our mundane experience of like linear time and space, I think, that evolved as a kind of survival mechanism, right? So we don't get eaten by the tiger, so we can find the right food to eat and stuff like that. But as far as we know, there may be many more dimensions of time and space that like we're not even aware of, that are kind of interpenetrating with the time and space that we're in now. And so, but there may be deeper levels of us, like our intuition or whatever, that's in contact with this, but normally it's below the threshold of our awareness. I mean, I've been deeply interested in hypnosis and self-hypnosis from even before I got interested in meditation. I started doing experiments in hypnosis when I was like 16, right? So I'm a firm believer that most of what we call our waking consciousness, it's like the executive office. It's maybe like the top 2 or 3% of like what's going on. And I think my meditation practice of mindfulness, a lot of that is becoming aware of the body as a way of harmonizing more the kind of conscious and unconscious, but then also the unconscious as like embodied, that we have a whole bunch of energies and things moving around kind of within our body. But then past that, it's like we're not bounded by this thin layer of skin that can extend out into the environment. And so that practice of mindfulness, it starts with that kind of integrating the mind and the body, the conscious to the unconscious, expanding that out into our environment, expanding that out into our world, expanding that out into our cosmos. And so I think that we can learn a lot from the kind of Jungian frame, because again, those archetypes, like if we want to look at things like like the wise old man or the wise old woman or the the seductress or the hero or whatever, they appear in our stories. And so it all goes back to how we tell stories and the significance of stories. And I think, and this is what I noticed in my data, is that a lot of these experiences, especially like precognitive experiences and clairvoyant experiences, happen in dreams. And I think they happen in dreams because our normal waking senses kind of go offline. And that allows us, like, again, I don't accept this idea that dreams are just bounded. Like when we're dreaming, it's just our brain farting, it's just like our neurons firing. And so they're all like self-contained in our skulls. I think that when we dream, it actually activates other senses. We talk about the sixth sense, but I mean, who knows how many other senses we have, right? But it activates other senses. So sometimes information comes through elsewhere, either in space or elsewhere in time, and that can kind of intrude into the dream world, and then we can carry that, that has impact in the waking world. And I think just to talk about Rick's experience, because you mentioned that the truck crash, and I think what's really amazing about that is not only did he have that dream, but his cousin had the same dream on the same night, and then both of them were in the truck when the truck crashed. So that's like on multiple levels, because it's not just somebody's subjective experience, which again you could discount as like, hey, that's that whole deja vu thing where you think you're remembering something that's actually never happened before. But you actually have, but again, how do I know that his cousin had this? Did I go interview his cousin? No, I'm just listening to Rick's story, but I don't have any reason to doubt that it's actually a true story. You know what I mean? So I can take a kind of radically skeptical view, and then I can just decide that I'm going to dismiss it. But I don't do that, and I say, okay, when these kind of paranormal things, there's different levels, right? There's very subjective. Oh, I had a dream and it came true, or I thought my friend was going to call and they called, up to two people having the same dream at the same time about something that's going to happen, which happens a year later, exactly as both of them dreamed it. That's like on an entirely different level. And they seem to, like, in my survey, I asked, have you ever felt like you were encountering, sensing, feeling, the spirit, or another entity, could be deceased, might not be, and like 40% of the people in my survey said yes, right? And some of them were just like, my grandmother died, and then I had a very vivid dream, and it felt like it was really her. So that's one end of it. The other one is like, you get like a full-blown visitation or something like that, where they impart information about something that they couldn't know otherwise. And so there's that whole range, but it seems that actually it could be at least a fair number of us have had some kind of at least sense that we're encountering other kind of intelligent entities that aren't human, that isn't coming through our normal kind of everyday experience. And I think those anomalous phenomena probably are a lot less rare than might be commonly thought.
Yeah.
Just because there is that stigma, and what you do is you tell your close friends and you tell your family, but you won't get up there at a conference and be like, hey, but like in Rick's case but those things matter, because what people do is they come up with two different narratives, like, say prior to Rick coming out of the closet, they'll be like, oh, why did you decide to go into analytical philosophy? And then they come up with a very rationalistic explanation. Oh, I was interested in these certain problems and blah, blah, blah. But like the actual real story is they had an earth shattering experience of this a precognition that changed the frame. And I think those kind of drivers, because when they strike that close to home, they are existential. They're kind of earth shattering. They're kind of paradigm shifting. But then people are too afraid to talk about them. It's just like,
we don't have
what?
institutions now. I think in different cultures and different times, there would be institutions where you could almost go and plan to have those things, because like the Pythagoreans would do like these incubation rituals, and there's great like Hellenistic scholars that are really interested like you in the phenomenology and believing it rather than discrediting it, and kind of going into like what was Western shamanism like, and what was the Greeks had incredible knowledge of medicine, psychedelics, like you said, Plotinus. Like there's clear evidence of contemplative practices that far out exceed what you would get if you asked like a high school teacher what contemplation was. And the when you have such an experience, and there's not someone that's like maybe seen how to make sense of those experiences and can give you a frame to then play with that new thing that's now in your consciousness, that's grabbing your memory and your thinking and your feelings, and doesn't, it's incongruous with maybe your egoic kind of rational part of yourself that wants to view it. And it takes a really skilled kind of Jungian to both not lose the rationality nor the intuition, and broaden both. And you know, you don't lose the reason, but you also don't lose the theophany, or the self-transforming element of the mystical, or the alchemical, or the imaginal, or you know, it's tough because I don't know why, but in monotheism, having these experiences either makes you a prophet or a crazy person. You can't be like a layman with these experiences. And I think a lot of people want to not be a prophet, or don't want to be a whatever. So then they don't have a home for it, and it fades into the background. Or like if you're lucky, maybe you have a community like Rick did that was tolerant of you know, these different levels of consciousness, or these different kind of experiences that they were probably all having, or at least a lot of them were having. So it's
Absolutely. And there was a synergy. I think there was a synergy too that was actually amplifying because there's a kind of a group, there's a kind of you know, I talked to Rick about and I mentioned them in my Altered States book, you know, the Merry Pranksters, you know, with Ken Kesey and the Merry Ken you know, Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
oh yeah.
Yeah, he you know, you know, he was he volunteered as a guinea pig at Menlo Park. There was a CIA funded experiments with psychedelics, and so he got introduced to like LSD and, you know, mescaline and all kinds of stuff. And then he, you know, he's the lab rat that escaped the lab, and and he started up. He had a whole kind of group of followers, and they were called the Merry Pranksters. And they went around in their day glow bus, and they took like really huge amounts of acid, and they, you know, they drove around the country, and they were, you know, they threw these acid tests with the Grateful Dead. You know, they were still called the Warlocks or whatever. But they talk about there was the unspoken thing, and there was which was like the group thing that they had, and there was a lot of, they had telepathic experiences, you know, amongst each other, because they were, you know, they were a group, they were entering these really profound altered states of consciousness, and those barriers that we erect to say, okay, this is me and this is you, and we're separate from each other and stuff like that. They were kind of, the psychedelics just kind of ripped that away. And I think in Rick's community too, it was just that the whole lifestyle of meditation and contemplation, and you know, and Rick was like very strict vegetarian, things like that. I think it really amplified those abilities. But you're exactly right, because there isn't, and I think you see the same thing with psychedelics, with you know, a lot of young men experiment with psychedelics and can go off the rails and end up, you know, having really, you know, serious mental health problems, or dying or whatever. You know, it's that whole like, you know, 27 Club, you know, where people, you know, where you get, you know, like Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin or whatever, Amy Winehouse. It's like young adults, I think especially males, really want to push boundaries about how, you know, what are the limits of their experience and what are the limits that they can withstand. And in traditional societies, there were rites of passage.
Right.
You know, people had vision quests, or people went out into the jungle, and there was a transition from, okay, you were a child when you came in, and now you're an adult. And a lot of those involve altered states, and a lot of those involve paranormal stuff. But when it's just happening to you randomly, and then you're told not to talk about it, or it's ignored or whatever, then you're kind of left to your own devices. And you know, my other person, Kat, who I did the whole chapter on, who is also a psychic sensitive, you know, her parents were like, oh, you know, you're mentally ill. And they brought her to the hospital, and she spent 10 years on antipsychotics, and eventually was able to break away from that. And she immigrated to New Zealand. And, you know, she's been, you know, drug free, and she's not schizophrenic, but what was happening is she was having very profound psychic experiences and was getting kind of off balance and would need that kind of direction and that kind of structure, but instead, was had something very violent done to her, and very stigmatizing, and could have easily ended up like a casualty of the whole mental health thing. But so the people that come out the other end takes a tremendous amount of resolve and inner strength and things like that. And you're right, and it's sad that it even has to happen, because we've lost that kind of those kind of containers. And I think a lot of people too, like, I was thinking about this today, that people like Rick and people like Kat, and even somewhat in my own experience, a lot of these experiences happen when they're younger, childhood, early adulthood, and then they kind of recede kind of later as you get into, like, your 30s, 40s, kind of middle age or whatever. And I'm wondering if that's just a function of age, or that might be a function of culture, because those skills and abilities aren't cultivated, and they're not. There's this kind of natural, how there's this natural pruning that happens of our kind of neuro.
No, I mean, so Rick got a perfect LSAT score. The LSAT, it's the law school kind of entrance exam.
Yeah,
right. So he's, and we would talk about this, and so both of us have a photographic memory, or something that can be described as that. And
wow,
I've like I said, I've been a cognitive scientist a little bit, and the research shows that after around like 11 years old, like, kids can go from like a photo perfect, it's not like there's a little camera and it's getting every speck of dust, but it's like, compared to 99% of people, it's like this whole different fidelity of capture of information, you could think, and then recall of that information. And then around 7 to 11, as semantic processing comes online, most people, it drops off and it just disappears and they lose access to it. And I have fought like the devil to keep mine active. And I would quote things, and I'd have like a professor say, like, you should have cited this. And then I'd just like cite 9 lines of the text like verbatim. And I'm like, that's why I didn't cite it, because I know this as a fact. Like, I know this more than you do, because you didn't even remember it in the paper you assigned us. And it's tough, because it really is it's imagistic, and it's not as linguistic. So keeping both systems kind of humming in harmony is it's challenging, right? I think it's not challenging anymore, but it was challenging to figure out, because that whole ability disappears. And I'm like, that's cheating at life. I want that. I want to be able to have a really dynamic imagination and a really powerful memory. So and then like meditation, spiritual practices, I think just again synergize. So people maybe like Rick, that had a very powerful imagination and visuospatial, emotional, cognitive processing as a child, and then goes into like 20 to 40 hours a week of meditation with like really, really advanced meditators, could then unlock these kind of synergies in the mind that might allow, like you said, these kind of nonlinear inferential processes to happen, or something like that.
Absolutely. And that's phenomenal too, what you said about how, because I do think that just from what little I know, that there is this kind of play between this kind of linguistic, conceptual thinking, and that more kind of imaginal and kind of visual kind of thinking that takes place. And it reminds me of because I start the book, I basically start my book in the preface talking about how when I was 16 and I was experimenting with this self hypnosis, I decided I was going to do. I'd read about people that could remember past lives, so I decided, okay, I'm gonna to a regression, and I'm gonna try to remember my past life. And so when I was 16, I sat in my bed at night, and I would go back. Okay, now I'm 15, now I'm 14, now I'm 13, and I would slowly go back through the years until I was younger, and I got to when I was one, and I was my hands were kind of moving around and my legs like I was like in my crib, and all of a sudden there's this like bang, there's this like blue duck, like I see this little blue ducky is just
Yeah,
like
yeah.
bang, just like right there, and it was so startling that it like snapped, kind of snapped me out of it, and
You totally
I
forgot
didn't go
this.
back. Yeah, no memory of it at all, and I
Yeah.
and I didn't go, I didn't remember past lives or anything.
Uh-huh.
So then I was like, okay, I got to find out about this. So the next day I went and asked my mother. I said, okay, did I have a little blue ducky, when I was one? And then she's like, oh no, I don't think so. And then she's like, oh, wait a minute. When you were 1 year old, you had a little blue ducky that you played with in the bath. There are no pictures of it, no images of it, nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
So then fast forward, 5 or 6 years, I'm at university, I'm at Grinnell College, and I'm taking this introduction to psych course. And there's this cognitive psychologist up there. And he's like, he wanted to know what people's earliest memories were. Of course, and he was, he was a adherent to schema theory, right? So no one has any memories until they've developed the cognitive schema. So
Right,
people go
right.
back, are you
Yeah.
3, are you 4, whatever. And I was just like, oh, put up my hand. Oh, I had a memory from when I was one. He's like, oh yeah, how did that? And I was like, well, I did this, self hypnosis, da, da, da. And it was like you could hear the crickets,
Oh yeah.
you know. And then that's when I realized I was like, and then right after that, because I'm taking this course on like Asian philosophy or Asian religion or something, a Buddhism course, and I come across this Edward Kanza's book on, I think it's called Buddhist Scriptures or something like that. And they have an account of like, okay, if a monk wants to remember his past lives, go to a certain spot, sit down after your morning meal, and then start remembering what you did earlier that day, and then what you did the day
Yeah, yeah.
before, and
Where,
then
yeah,
what you
yeah.
did the week. And it was the exact same technique. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
when I was like, wait a minute, maybe Buddhists knew stuff that like modern like science people like don't know.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
was kind of the beginning when I was like, there's
Right.
knowledge that that people have had that most people don't know about, that's worth paying attention to. And so there's
Yeah.
that was like my first introduction to, and that would fit into, because that's what you were talking about, that eidetic.
Right. Yeah. I don't like to use that word, but yeah,
Okay,
no, not for bad reasons, but
right.
I think that's right because I like in psychology imprinting the way ducks imprint on their mothers. And there seems
Oh
to be
yeah,
some
okay.
cognitive
Yep, yep.
function where we like hyper map things onto archetypes and go like that is mother, and it just like way deep in the unconscious kind of
Yep,
maps in there.
yep.
And then you're just religiously devoted to watching your parents or watching whatever you're kind of imprinted upon for a very formative part of your life, and then again it kind of recedes because it's like the consciousness can't manage it or something for most people, or it's not productive. Like you said, we have these survival needs. So if you're having recollections of when you were one as you walk through like a tiger infested area, you might not survive and pass on that capacity compared to less introspective people.
Yeah, and
um,
having that kind of the emphasis put on, you look at the whole linguistic turn that happened like in the 90s, where it was like they really were throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because they're basically trying to say that, oh, it's all just, it's like it's like the Wittgenstein language game people,
right,
where
I
it's
hate
just
that.
all
Yeah.
it's like all just language. It's like, what are you saying, that people can't have non-linguistic, you know, concepts? And my ex-wife did a whole PhD on dog cognition,
Oh,
and
cool.
they were like 20 years ago, people would say, well, dogs can, so some people don't even think that dogs are conscious. It's like, well, obviously you don't have a dog, because
Right. You
it's
haven't
like, not
watched one
only
for
are
an
they
hour.
conscious,
Yeah.
they're not only conscious, they have feelings, they have emotions, they dream like we do. And
Right.
of course they think, they can problem solve, right? They can be, they basically have a notion of other minds and all, and that's not linguistic, right?
I
they're
think
not they're not
shame keeps people from identifying with animals. I think it's so easy to realize that animals are intelligent, feeling beings, but there's some kind of like disassociation almost in society. I'm not like that. I'm much more superior. But my cat tricks me into feeding it. Like my cat's smart enough to get me to fill its food. And yeah, I think the inner life of things is almost at jeopardy. When you talked about that disenchantment book, I feel like our whole inner lives are almost lost in this disenchantment that we experience. And it's like trying to sing and just screaming inside or something. It must be for people because there's so much richness in our souls. Again, kind of a Neoplatonic view of the self, or of what it is to be a being that has a intellect and a soul and participates in something greater than itself. And it's you can spend all day being kind of aware of that, or have little flickers of it that happen when you really lose yourself in a flow state, or get really caught up in someone's conversation. Like Alan Watts makes you dream again, or some of these speakers that you were saying, oh yeah, I used to think so much more vividly about myself in the world. And yeah, I think the it's great because the internet is really, I think, helping connect academics who want to study this stuff. They would have been so alone before this capacity. Say, oh, I didn't know you in New York also could intelligently contribute to my project. And oh, I didn't know you in Florida knew someone that might contribute, or something like that. And it's really allowing people that would be considered almost like Gnostic by a very materialist, solipsistic, skeptical kind of point of view, and they can actually do research and kind of learn from each other. So I think it's really and John Vervaeke, I'll send you some of his stuff. Like he's really open to all the things that you and Rick have talked about. And with the Vervaeke Foundation, John he did a podcast one time. I'll try and find it and send it to you, where he was interviewing a therapist, and the therapist was working with a schizophrenic, and the therapist had a mystical experience that he then shared and used in what he thought like helped the patient and he understand the situation better. So
Wow.
the idea of like a therapist trying to use like a theophanic vision to heal the mind of someone is really kind of a groundbreaking from a kind of 1990s science point of view or something like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think there is, I mean, I a couple years back, I went through a period where I got really involved in intensively in psychotherapy, just because I wanted to. I felt like I was kind of my practice had kind of stalled out a bit, and I really wanted to engage a kind of process that was relational, and also much deeper engagement than the kind of cognitive behavioral approach where it's like, okay, you have an OCD and this is how we're going to cure it in five steps, kind of thing. But like meet with someone for 2 hours a week for like weeks and weeks and weeks. And there were moments when things would happen that were like, they were like this intuitive kind of thing that would just like happen. And it was like, holy crap. Like that's how I realized I was non-binary, because my entire life I was like trying to perform masculinity, and it wasn't it was like after a year and a half or 2 years of psychotherapy, all of a sudden we went in a direction that I didn't think, never even thought about, and I was like, holy crap, this is why this explains so much of who I am, because I've been performing this gender role that I've never really felt that I was. And it was just it was, and I'm not doing it now, but I mean that by itself was life transforming, because I was able to, and that's the kind of thing that we lose out. I mean, like it's the double-edged sort of technology, right? Because it can bring this kind of shared thing together,
right. But you can objectify yourself as well. Yeah.
And then it's also like with social media and everything, and this superficial sort of skimming across. And it's interesting too to plot the trajectory, because we went from like kind of face-to-face meetings to going online with COVID and everything. And then my therapist actually moved away. And so, we continued for a while, but there was something about, but the real breakthroughs happened when we were like in the same room
Yeah.
together. And
Seeing
so
and
there's
being
some,
seen, the dialectic of two people pursuing the good of one person or of both people is, I think, uh, perpetually virtuous or something like that. Like again, like the
yeah,
Platonists
yeah,
being able to
yeah,
pursue the depth of the self and this philosophic expression. And I another one of Rick and I's friends who we have read multiple philosophy books with together and done lots of spiritual practice together. Two of them actually are trans, identify as trans. And if your identity is so narrow, it's not even repression almost. It's Jung would say like it almost falls away, and it can be repressed too. So if a parent says you're not
mm,
left-handed or you're not this or you're not whatever, it can repress. But even in time and space, we can lose contact with certain parts of ourselves. And then if you and a therapist or you and a friend, or a lot of times people someone new will just come into their life and say, "Oh, you're that," and you go, "Oh, I am," or whatever. Like not maybe not that quickly, but sometimes that quickly, and then all of a sudden you're flourishing again, and it's like uh, uh, all sorts of creative energy is back within the psyche and the self, and able to then express itself in time and space. And yeah, I think a much richer view of the mind and the soul would go a long way in the scientific worldview. Um,
yeah,
and I love what we're
absolutely.
talking about.
And that investing in just being able to, that kind of that unconditional kind of positive regard. I mean, I do some counseling myself, and I really found that it's that kind of the person-centered approach
Mhm.
where it becomes a safe it becomes like a safe space where you can be seen and you can be heard, and you know that you're not going to be judged. Yeah, is amazing. And just to be like, oh, I don't have to keep performing this role anymore. That and I guess for me, it's like realizing that I was non-binary is was part of a process where I realized that where I can better embrace both the masculine and feminine aspects of my psyche, and
Yeah.
that real kind of Jungian sort of animus anima kind of way. And back in my mid 20s, I had this very profound psychedelic experience, which went horribly wrong, but at a certain point. But at a certain point, there was this kind of recognition that I was male and female, but then there was no place to kind of put that. And then because there was no category of non-binary, you were either male or you were female or you were trans, and so
Yeah.
then you were transitioning from one to the other. There was only the binary. And then when I discovered when there was a new vocabulary of non-binary, it was like wow. And then I realized too that initially there was a kind of more of an embrace of the feminine, because that's what I had been like. That was what was occluded and I'd been suppressing. But then I realized, being non-binary doesn't mean I'm any less masculine than I was before when I identified as male. It's now that I can fully embrace both my masculinity, like, and my femininity, and not have to feel like I have to perform one or the other to some kind of expectation. And I was like, and it felt more like there was just more of me that was being forced to fit into like a tighter box. And I think that kind of fits into what you're saying, is that like if we allow that more to go as much as it wants to go, rather than saying no, 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 you're a little boy, you're a little girl,
Yeah.
we don't you believe in Jesus but you don't believe in Allah, or we don't believe in spirits or ghosts, and so don't talk about things like that. All those kind of self-limiting things that we put up um, become really dangerous. And I think some of the psi that people might have uh, access to otherwise and cultivate and advance. Like really, I mean, for me, the big question is, how much of this is innate? How much of this can we cultivate? And if we start paying attention and actually working on cultivating, how far can we actually go?
Yeah.
Like, what is the limit to human potential? I don't think we're even close
Yeah.
to hitting any kind of upper limit. But when we systematically ignore and shame and stigmatize, then you say, okay, I'm not going to invest any energy there. And then you just lose those abilities. They become, and they're not, I don't think they're entirely gone, but what happens is because they're not cultivated, you kind of, there's a kind of disconnect. And for people who are really sensitive, and I talk a bit about it in my book too, that there is a dark side, and Rick's experienced this too, and
Yeah.
other people, that there are forces that are possibly malevolent, that um, that you need to protect yourself against. But if there's no community, if there's no teacher, if there's no guide, then you can just be at the whim of forces that you don't even understand. And
And I
so
think
it's
again
not
that
all
the psych
happiness and sunshine and
oh
light
no.
and rainbows. There
Well,
is
that's why they were
very
sacred, and they were off outside of society a little. You do these rituals, and there were people guiding you. I have a friend, he's done sleep yoga, and he's a professor of philosophy in California, and he has a really rich inner life. Um, and you really need a container for these processes in some sense to allow it to for like the alchemy to take place properly, because you um, you are playing with, like, I think, archetypal forces that are almost by definition bigger than you, because you need to confront something bigger than you to create that third thing that you grow from. So if it's just you or just the world, there's no conscious drama happening. But when both show up, and you have someone that can kind of guide you away from the bad paths if they kind of pop up, and keep you going through the momentum of the process, then you get rid of all those false idols within yourself, to speak a little bit ridiculously, and are rebirthed as a more full, like, I'm not just masculine, I'm not just feminine, I'm not just my work role, I'm not just my family role. And you get this fullness of being that, I don't know, I picture like a well that is perpetually spewing water, or like a sun that generates perpetual light. Oh, some image like that is the psychic center from which uh all of our creativity, or all of our potential comes from, or something like that. And then you know
Yeah, and I think too, and I think that idea of, like, because my idea of non-duality is not this, like, okay, let's whitewash everything into a clear, white light. It's more of like this finding a harmony where there's this kind of resonance between the kind of every part of every other part. And
yeah,
so it's
yeah.
that our own, as a point of subjectivity, yeah, that overflowing like out into the world, and that kind of merging with. And so you're not erasing the different parts of it, but it's more of this harmonious kind of resonating, I don't know what, symphony, harmony, or whatever,
Uh-huh.
between the different parts. And yeah, and I think that's the spiritual journey, I think. And that's where the psychology and philosophy and spirituality all kind of become part of a bigger picture. They're not all isolated out and
Right,
say
right.
we're just going to play language games, or we're just going to, like the Freudian approach of, like, we're all neurotic at best, and so we're just going to try to make you a little bit more functioning neurotic,
Yeah, yeah.
and then it also looks at, because I work with clients now, and and they talk about how, I just want to have like my own place where I can have privacy, and I just want to have my own, I want to work in a way that's meaningful,
Mm.
where I have enough, and I'm not forced into this like 40-hour grind. And then you start looking at like systemic cultural things, and how, like, global capitalism and the kind of, takeover by, multinationals, and the rampant consumerism and stuff like that. It's like you realize that they're all part of the picture, because it's like, they're saying I can't afford a house, and I can't afford to rent a place where I
Mm.
can actually have a self-contained unit. And that's
Right.
like a real that's like that's a real thing, right? And that's
That's
a
more
thing that,
real than
and
like
we've,
the angels singing at you or whatever. Yeah, you need to have a home, and yeah, after about
and
1600, the cost of living became like a full-time job for people. You can see like it really Kierkegaard lived in like a burgeoning time when you had both like economic prosperity and free time, but you don't see a
yeah,
lot of both because you have to like work like a horse to live this like consumptive lifestyle. And yeah, it's tyrannical for a lot of, especially if you're
yeah, and
creative, you're not very like success driven. Yeah.
it's wage slavery, and it's like, and I think that this is where, but I think we have to find our spirit, we have to find our spiritual selves, and go for psychological integration, and then keep going and change and work to change the world, because it's like, there's really, we're under a lot of existential threat right now, where, with the climate change and nuclear war and AI and all these kind of things, and the humanities are under threat. And it's like, holy crap, we're living in this age of accelerated change, where it's almost like, I feel like it's kind of like being on a roller coaster ride. It's like, we're all going to either just go right off the abyss, or, maybe get thrown into this new utopia. But it's like we're at a point where, um, it seems disingenuous not to acknowledge that there are these really serious social and cultural problems when dealing with individuals. And that's when I realized that we can't really separate out the psychological from the social, from the cultural, from the historical, from the spiritual, from the paranormal. All these things, they're all kind of like, sort of woven together. And I
Yeah.
like and I think what interests me about the paranormal, which was the same reason why I wanted to work on psychedelics, is it's like one of those fault lines. It's
Uh-huh.
one of those, it's like the occluded knowledge that it keeps knocking at the door, but no one's answering it. It's like, come on, people, open the freaking door, because we have to start acknowledging altered states of consciousness. We have to start acknowledging that there are anomalous things that are happening all the time,
Yeah.
that are very real, and we can't just bury our heads in the sand and pretend like they don't exist because we don't understand them, or are too afraid to understand them, or they don't fit into the agenda of, the power brokers that want to keep us on that, that treadmill of like,
Yeah.
wage slavery, and working so hard just so we can, pay our mortgage or pay our rent. It's just, I went on a bit of a rant there, but
No, no, it's cynical, and we live in a cynical time, and we kind of I I want to feel happy when I see my society flourishing and feel sad when I see it traumatized. And so many people, it's the opposite. They're either like numb or they are cynical, and it's really tough to, like you said, I think in Jungian language, like people are just going to project their shadow and live out these like masochistic and sadistic and harmful. I mean, we're self-annihilating ourselves in the we have this like 27-step supply chain that can bring like, the most gourmet meal to every one of us every day because of how sophisticated it is. And then at the same time, we don't know why we're unhappy. We don't know why depression is through the roof. We don't know why loneliness is through the roof. We don't know why religion is failing. It's like this is not random. These are not dots that are disconnected, and it's marketing is so pernicious. And one of Jung's nephews really influenced a lot of American marketing, because you can go back to like the 1850s and look at any ad, and they were very rational. And here's the benefits of my product. And now it's like a seductive myth, and you're going to become like a suave man at the bar, or you're going to be like, you buy this computer and you're going to be like Elon Musk. And it's this, we're self-manipulating each other. If we're the most honorable, virtuous things in existence, we're just like bastardizing uh gold or something like that. And it's uncomfortable. What I think is one of the biggest barriers, I don't know if this was true for you, but for me, there was like this period where I had to go through all of this pain, this like ignorance. I was ignoring parts of myself and what was, and that painful part of the self transformation Where when you get on the other side, you go, oh, I feel so whole now. Like this is so good. But that, you know, you could have stayed a few steps away from that door because of how awkward and painful and unfamiliar it is. That we need to kind of do that. And I love when people say like, I quit my CEO job, even though it made no sense because I knew I had enough money and there was something missing. Or um, like Rick is never ambitious. I've known him for like almost a couple of years now, and despite his intelligence, his position, his connections, I've never seen him try to like manipulate a system for like a bunch of gain, because to him that would be
Yeah.
like petty, and but that's not petty to I think a lot of people.
Yeah,
And
yeah, that's the game. Yeah, that's the game. That's the game that they that's the game
yeah,
that they play. Yeah, yeah. No, and it's amazing how we yeah, it's this kind of consensus trance that
yeah, yeah. It's like
that we play.
self-hypnosis, like you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and then this is I mean, this comes right from Charles Tart, who's done all this work on altered states. He basically said, he studied altered states for long enough, then he was like, okay, well, what's your ordinary waking state? And he realized, well, actually, there isn't any ordinary waking state. It's just a consensus trance. And how do
Uh-huh.
you break? And I see like the crisis that the university system in New Zealand is going through now. It's just like it goes all the way down. The student participation is totally dropped off and they're not engaging and they're going to university because they just want their degree. It's just turned into like a degree mill, and they're not participating and they're not engaging, and they've all been like attention captured by like social media. And I have like 60 students, and like less than a dozen come, or by the end of the semester are even coming to the
Right.
lectures. And I ask, how many have social media, and everybody does, everybody has some. And I ask, when was the last time, who here has read a book in the last, 2 or 3
Yeah,
weeks? And there's
yeah.
like three people. And I was like, how many have read a nonfiction book? And there's like one, there's like one
Right.
person.
I have a
It's like,
reading
holy shit,
practice. Yeah.
yeah, it's like we're in trouble. We're in trouble, you know?
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know if you know Rudolf Steiner. He has this quote. Do you know him at
Yeah.
all? He's kind of
I know.
paranormal.
Yeah, I know of him. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he says like, my soul is hungry for knowledge, and
Yeah.
it's like a Zen koan, or like a call to action or something. Where it's like, what does that feel like? How can I find that in myself to be hungry for another person's metaphysics and epistemology and what they're saying about virtue in the world and stuff like that. And um, yeah, I think COVID really, I think, re created this like feed forward positive feedback loop where it like encouraged people not to go to class and to get used to being quiet and not participating. And yeah, capitalism just like it encourages you to do what the criteria of success is rather than to do what your heart calls for, or what might just kind of be a playful fun way to uh to learn. And when you get struck by Emily Dickinson and she changes your life, or Henry Thoreau, or whoever it is, like I don't know, it's so amazing that you can have a professor like you who's spending their life driving around and flying around America and Asia and getting really deep on these things, and then they can tell you about it, and then you can 20 minutes later be in another room with someone teaching you about 50 years of computer science history, and then someone else telling you the principles of accounting. And then as you grow up, you're like applying those principles in your life and flourishing from all of the narrative knowledge and the inferential knowledge, the schema knowledge, or whatever. um, and that was kind of what people thought when they were trying to teach Greek to people in the Middle Ages, or uh, you know read Socrates, or I don't know as much about Buddhism, but like what I know about Buddhism, like the sutras are so rich, and there's so much, like just by reading it, some of them 10 or 20 times, you all of a sudden start to think differently and go like, oh, there are these like
Yeah.
layers of reality that I guess are real, but I'd never noticed before. And so yeah, I think it's really tragic if people don't like realize what they're losing out on.
Yeah, and it's scary because there's been this like attention capture by social media where like, TikTok video, it's like TikTok is like this junk food for your brain, and it's like hitting all these endorphins because you're getting this like rush of like visual images and nothing's more than like, 6 seconds long. It's like, fuck, this is frightening. And I tell them, I try to tell them just like point blank, listen, because I'm trying to teach them critical thinking. I'm like, listen, like your attention has been captured, right? What are you going to do about it? And then, like the course was structured so easily that, because they're trying to get everyone to pass because we lose our enrollments, we lose federal funding. And so there's all these systemic problems. But at the end of the lecture, I still have this time left. I'm like, all right, I want to talk about, this existential threat, either AI or nuclear war or, the environment. Or I'm like, you don't have to stay if you want because this isn't part of the assessed. And like everyone but like 2 students gets up and leaves.
Yeah.
And I'm like, if there's no world left to live in, your degree is going to be worth anything. It's like you are the next generation. It's like we broke the world. If somebody doesn't do something to fix it, it is going to end. This isn't going to be. It's like, is this going to be on the exam? No.
Right.
Okay, they get up
It's
and
like
they fucking leave.
instrumentalized
Like,
the integrity of their mind. They've turned it into like you said, there's junk food, and then there's it's all instrumental. It's all what's the utility
completely
calculation.
instrumental.
And Jung was great about saying like if you're using your imagination purely, or your mind, whatever you want to call it, purely instrumentally, you're missing out on like the moon or whatever. You're the finger in the moon. You're just seeing this tiny part of reality. And now it's even worse. Like we've become a danger to ourselves. That wasn't true in the 1500s. The French and the British could kill each other for 100 years or 200 years, and it just ruined the soil or whatever. And now we can actually pollute like the Great Lakes, and we can create nuclear waste that floats across the Atlantic. And it's
oh yeah, we can
incredible.
the Anthropocene. It's like we can just we're issuing in the next mass extinction, and we're doing it. And so sometimes it's kind of like, well, I guess karma, maybe our time is up, and make way for something that might be better. That might be better. But
yeah,
Robert, I have an 11 o'clock.
We've talked so long. I was going to try and wrap this up like 4 times, and I kept getting drawn back into it. So
I could go on it. It's just like when Rick and I talk. It's like eventually we have to be like, all right, we just have to stop now. But I hope you got some useful stuff. I mean,
this was cool.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really get too much into the content of the book, but that's good because if it teases some people, that's great.
Yeah, and maybe either if you have a copy you could share with me, or just once it's released, I'll buy a copy, and then we can talk maybe about more details, because I've interviewed a few other authors, and not having read the book, I can't really ask you things that I would care about. I think it's the crude way to say it.
And I think when it comes out, I'll see if I can secure a copy for you or something, and then we could.
I have no problem with any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so. and then we could talk. You could talk again. Yeah, and then you could go to the finer points, because I think a lot of it will come out. I really tried to, once I kind of set the stage, I really tried to let my participants kind of speak for themselves. So there's a lot of content, which is just, and I tried to preserve, because part of my idea of narrativity is it's co-created. So keeping that dialogue there, so you can see how it kind of emerges, but with the conversation, and sticking close to like their voices to basically give them a voice so that other people can have that access to it. And so you won't, so when you get an extra chance to hold it in your hand and read it, I'd love to get your feedback and your thoughts on it too. So
cool. Yeah, well, great, Dee, and maybe we can do this again sometime, or just talk about philosophy, or meet up with Rick, and I would love to hear about some of your Buddhist thoughts, because there's not a lot of good English Buddhist scholarship that is in this domain. Rick was saying a little earlier, and I think it's so ironic that there can be really awesome meditators that never publish on it, or people that just don't bring that part of themselves into their work, and the academic richness when that happens is super cool. So
yeah, and the subject too, and it was the same thing with the psychedelics, because so many Buddhist scholars, experimented with psychedelics, but nobody would ever want to talk about it. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to talk about it. And I think it's the same thing with the paranormal too. That's so much of Buddhism, well, for a very long time, it's still kind of stuck in this philological, let's study the tech stuff. And even just studying contemporary Buddhism was kind of a fringe thing. It's kind of established now and it's okay. But then to take that into the paranormal and then to talk about like my own personal experience, because it's like, like a lot of the people that are telling you about these profound paranormal experiences that they had were actually Buddhist studies scholars. And so obviously these things, when Tara appears to you and tells you all this shit, it's definitely going to inform your research, right? Because it tells you about the reality of this on an entirely different level. But, you could read every article and every book by this person and you'd never know that. And so it's kind of weird. And that's all what I'm trying to do is like, I'm trying to move the conversation forward. Being like, and because I'm not career driven like Rick, so I'm not trying to climb that ladder. It's like, I don't, if half my colleagues, 90% of the other Buddhist studies people think I'm crazy, I don't honestly care, because I know that it's going to connect to the people that actually get what I'm talking about. So yeah, I'm happy to talk. I'm more than happy to talk about Buddhism. And I think because I had that philological, I'm so happy that I had that philological training, because the people that
then you can debunk it and not get seduced by it, right?
Yeah, and people can't poo-poo me. They can't be like, oh, well, they don't know what they're talking about because this is what the texts say. It's like, well, folks, I read Sanskrit, I read Pali, I read classical Tibetan. I can play that game the same way that you can. So they can't just be like, oh, they're just a wannabe. They're not real
I
Buddhist
read
studies.
Greek, and I've read Plotinus in Greek and Plato in Greek, and yeah, it's not just a language game. That's almost the lamest if you're interested in this stuff, to like create new words or write down more propositions. And it's Rick says it in some of these reading groups, how like kind of frustrating it is to live in the analytical philosophy world and be kind of a phenomenologist who has like a spiritual bent, and it really,
oh yeah, hell yeah, I can imagine. It's like playing a symphony to people who are fucking tone deaf. It would just be like it's so great to see him breaking out of that mold, and sort of he's like entering into this whole like next phase of his life, I think, where there's this kind of integration between this very analytical side of him and this much more like intuitive spiritual side of him. They're kind of like coming together, and it's pretty phenomenal to actually see it happen. He is really an amazing person. I mean,
I love Rick.
they talk about there's this kind of 1% of people who are like very psychically sensitive, and I would say that he, in my mind, he fits into that category, that he really is like exceptional that way. And also just, and his level of humility and kind of intellectual integrity is really,
all of it.
It's like it all kind of comes. He's a real mensch.
I studied training at a really good graduate program, and when I would go to like an applied project, sometimes you'd be like making a training manual on some like $1 million machine, and sometimes you'd meet someone that worked there that was so self-aware and articulate and had the knowledge. And when you have that kind of person to like draw on as a resource, you're like, oh, you really have this very rich view of what's happening here, not a very crude, simple, practical view. And yeah, Rick is such a brilliant mind and a loving, humble guy. And like he spends all his free time teaching meditation for free, and participates in book chapters he has no benefit from. And it's I would love to know if you could like say what are the 7 criteria to find more Ricks in the world, and then give them power or something.
hell yeah, and just acknowledge it and say it's real, and let them talk to each other so that we could like advance this past, because it's like we all have these, so there's so much. I just see all the potential that we have just as individuals and as like a culture, and I see us just fucking it up so bad, and just so much pain and so much suffering, and saying, oh God, we can do better. We can do so much better, you know. And so when it's not, but when it's not valued, or when people are silenced, so yeah, it's great that too, that people like you that are doing this thing and getting that
Yeah, I love it.
conversation out. So
Because
yeah,
I don't want to throw away
it's
science. That's the thing, is like I don't want to go
yeah,
like, oh, I found all these mystical things and I'm going to throw out science. So if you can kind of keep both alive, and again, the Platonists I think are such good role models, because Proclus was a great scientist and Plotinus was a great thinker, and the pre-Socratics and Socrates, like they were very, very deep thinkers, and they thought about astrology
absolutely.
and
And I
astronomy.
think at its core, it's like that kind of commitment to empiricism and falsifiability and things like that. I mean, they're just amazing. Epistemologically, they're just amazing, fruitful ways to approach the world. It's like when science becomes scientism, and we shift into that dogmatism, and there's this kind of fear, and it might be like part of the herd mentality, and it might be about control, or there's a whole bunch of things it might be about. And basically, what my book is in part trying to do is trying to break, because there's a kind of religious dogmatism that you
Hmm.
get in canonical accounts, which are really have an agenda. You know, they want to aggrandize Buddhism, and the Buddhist saints are better than everybody else, and the Buddha was the ultimate, blah, blah, blah. And then you get the scientific dogmatism of like, no, this can't be true because our science tells it can't, and say, okay, let's get rid of all that dogmatism, and we go back to the empirical, like what is happening,
Right,
and
what's the
keeping
shared
that
reality
open-ended.
here? Yeah,
Yeah, where do they come together? Because I'm the same way. It's like you can't just pretend, like can't be like, oh, science, it's
right.
like,
Yeah,
no, it doesn't, because it's a quest for knowledge, and it's a way of probing into reality that I think the only way, like human knowledge has to be holistic. It has to be, because that's how we relate. We want the whole picture. And
yeah,
if we
yeah.
can't just compartmentalize and ignore stuff because it doesn't fit into the box. And so I think where science and spirituality, they have to both play a part. Totally.
Cool.
Absolutely.
I think
All
that
right,
was a
Robert.
great way to end, and have a
Yeah,
nice rest of
cool.
your day.
And yeah, and do stay in touch, and I'll be happy to continue the conversation, because I really love doing this stuff too. So
Cool, yeah, and let me know once the book's out, because either way, if I don't hear from you before then, or you don't hear from me, we'll definitely pick this up
yeah,
again.
I will definitely give you a heads up when it gets into
Cool.
print. All right, take care.
Take care. Bye bye.